I'm standing between you and lunch, so hopefully this is interesting enough. I'm Munir Squires at UBC. This is the co-author of San Juan. So I'm going to talk to you about marriage, and specifically about the decision to, or about the structure of different societies, where in some societies or in some cultures, people marry others that are very close to them. Think of like a network in society. So you can marry someone who's closely connected to you from your community, from your caste, from whatever group in society you come from. Or other societies that are much more exogamous, people marry someone very kind of socially distant from them, and trying to understand or kind of think of that as a sort of optimal decision that people are making, and that they're making some trade-offs when they decide who to marry and whether to marry someone who's like them or someone who's far away from them. And I'm going to study this with historical US data. So the basic idea is that across societies and over time, there's this broad correlation between places that have very strong extended family ties. They have kinship structures that matter for social organization, and the correlation between the presence of those things and economic outcomes, broadly speaking. So typically, places that have strong family ties tend to be poorer, tend to have less stable institutions, and less democracy, et cetera. So this paper is documenting those correlations. And then there's kind of this argument by Joe Henrich, who has a book about this, where he argues that basically the decline of kinship and strong family ties in Europe was a major driver of the emergence of kind of the modern world, like of the scientific revolution, of individualism, of the ideas of liberty that kind of underpin the Industrial Revolution and the growth of the West. But obviously that's hard to test empirically. And the idea that I'm going to try to focus on today is this idea that there may be a static versus dynamic trade-off in the types of marriage ties that you make. And what I mean by that is, you might think that in a static sense, given a society as it exists, in the absence of very well-functioning markets and institutions that can kind of protect an individual as a lone individual, you need the protection of a group. You need a kind of a group around you. It could be your family, or it could be another group, but you need like a set of people who have very tight, cohesive links with each other and are willing to provide insurance for each other, willing to protect each other from predation, are willing to engage in joint production together. And so you can think of this, for example, as in the agrarian world in the US, like pre-industrialization, the way that you earn an income and the way that you earn a living as an adult is typically through either kind of inheriting land or working land of your family, or it's having a loan from your uncle to start a business, or it's somehow relying on ties of your community or your family, versus kind of an industrial, modern, urban world where maybe the returns to an individual are higher if they're mobile, if they're able to move to where the jobs are, able to move to where the opportunities are. So I'm interested in this trade-off, basically, or in this idea that there may be like static gains from these strong cooperative networks that can help each other, versus the dynamic gains of being kind of an atomic nuclear family that can move around and take advantage of opportunities wherever they are. And I'm going to do that by studying marriage links, by studying who people marry and how they choose that. Okay, so what we do in this paper is first introduce this idea of what we call marital distance. And importantly, distance here is not geographic distance. So what we're interested in is think of society as a network. And individuals in society, when they choose who to marry, can choose to marry someone who's very close to them in the network or someone who's far away from them in the network. And so that's what we mean by marital distance. We're going to calculate that using a very large data set of genealogical data from the US. So think about like one of these websites, kind of like Ancestry, although it's not Ancestry, where you can enter your family history and then you can link it to other people and you can link census records, and there's all this kind of machinery that's happening. So we have some of this data, and we use that to measure exactly how close spouses are to each other. And what I'm going to show you today is that first, people who marry others who are close to them are a lot less mobile, both geographically and economically in terms of occupations. And yet, especially in the earlier periods, I'll show you trends. In the earlier period,
so you think about this as casual, or you think that people that are so it goes from left to the left?
Obviously, I mean, yeah, both directions are happening. I agree. I will show you some causal evidence. Yeah, so I have an idea that yeah. So certainly, once you're in a more mobile setting or economy, you're more likely to marry someone who's farther from you, but also vice versa. Okay. And I want you to, well, I don't know if it's the way to think of it is as a puzzle, but I'm going to show you that Americans, people in this data, marry others who are far closer to them than they would have at random, if they're marrying, for example, within their county at random. So people are choosing selectively to marry someone who's very close to them. And then I document this kind of trade-off that I was referring to earlier on about this potentially benefits, like kind of the static cooperation benefits of marrying someone close to you, and the potential kind of dynamic advantages of mobility, which mean that that you can take advantage of economic opportunities, but maybe at the cost of having, for example, old age support, or at the cost of having help with the children, if if your children need to be cared for while you're working, etc., by your grandparents, for example.
Sorry, can you just elaborate why it's a puzzle? Because you're more likely to know people who live close to you. Well, so you don't know people randomly in your county, you know people who are close to you, you go to school with people that are close to you. So is that really how we should, the benchmark, it's random benchmarks that are...
I mean, I think it's useful to think of the marriage decision as not being a mechanical one of just being exposed to certain people when you're growing up, and then you just randomly marry one of them or something, or you marry someone who's close to you, and instead thinking that as sort of to some extent, an optimizing decision that people are making, where they're deciding what would be, you're, in a sense, when you marry someone, you're making a link, it's an alliance, so you're making, in a sense. You can choose to either reinforce existing links, so you already are very closely connected to this person, and you're reinforcing those links, or you can choose to make a link outside to another group, which might have more useful connections, which might have other advantages, and you're kind of choosing from a broader set, and so presumably you can somehow make a better match, at least in some ways. So that's kind of the way I think of the decision. Yeah.
I mean, this, as you know, this half percent argument.
Yeah.
For insurance, but you also get insurance from diversification.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's never been clear to me how much insurance comes from having somebody close, how much you could have from having somebody in a different area and getting.
My sense is that it's kind of non-monotonic in the sense that if you're too distant, you're not really going to have a lot of substantial material insurance in the sense, like if families link from too far away, but yeah, within the range of families that are close to you, you might think that someone was at least somewhat different so that they have different shocks. Might be better, yes. I mean, in development, especially, there's a literature on this in Africa.
I'm sure you can say no, but just to understand this slide, I'm very confused. So here, distance, the measure of marital distance, and the mobile, are they both refer to geographic?
No, neither.
Okay.
Oh yeah, sorry. The mobility is both geographic and occupational. But the
Okay.
distance I'm talking about here is not geographic. It's in the network. I'll show you what I mean by the network distance, but yes, that's a difference. Yeah, maybe that's confusing. So this is an illustration of what I mean by marital distance. So imagine a hypothetical husband and a wife, so they get married, so they're creating this link in this network. One second, and then you can potentially connect these two people by pre-existing links. In this case, I've shown who their relatives are. So this is the mother, the father of the husband, for example, the father and mother of the wife. And in this case, don't worry about the details, but there is a path that connects them through, this husband's uncle was married to the aunt of this woman. And so they were connected not by blood, so they're not relatives, they're not cousins, but they have some family connection. Okay, so this is quite a close connection. They would probably know that they're connected in this way. This would be a path of distance 7. So you can count like 7 connections between these two people. And that's the type of distance that I'm thinking about, yeah.
So I'm just thinking that this maps exactly to the social networks literature, especially on the concept of how it's trying to weak links and network criticalness. So there's a paper by Carlin, Mobius and others, like 2009 debate, that proposes a measure of this called the network closure. So there's a mathematical formula, etc. And the other side of it, that so it tells the story, the first story that you just told, and the other side of it that may lead to the effect of mobility is that you get better information with strength of links. So
Yes, yeah. Exactly. So I would think of it that way. So marrying close is like strong ties that you can protect each other, you can close in, you can form this cohesive tight group. Marrying out gives you this like strength of weak ties. Your in-laws are kind of from a different part of the network, they have different information, different access to resources, different connections, and different cities, etc. Although again, distance here is not geographic, but it's
How salient is this though? Like, I mean, this I can see, like that, it's
Yeah.
quite close, right?
yes.
It's like 10 or.
So I'm not, so nothing in this relies on the idea that people know what the connection between them is. But if you just imagine that there's a community that is of modest size that only it marries within itself, over time, you will always be able to trace a relatively short path between any two spouses within that set. Does that make sense? So it's like, whereas if people are just marrying nationally, they're going to university in different states and marrying at someone from a totally different place, the path is going to be much, much longer. Of course, they're not going to know, they wouldn't be able to trace out that path if you asked them, but it still tells you something. Sorry?
The abilities of historical sources, the ability things like that, it should be a problem.
Yeah, I'll speak to that about the ability, but basically we can link people very successfully. Yeah.
Just clarifying if those people first, so the minimum distance, I guess, for that varies by state, is that something that you're gonna use later on?
No, I don't use the minimum per se. I'll show you.
Like, there is a minimum, right? I mean, two certainties.
So the data is so big that you can observe two,
Okay.
but probably those are data errors, like someone entered the wrong ID of something, or they misclassified a brother for a husband or something. But they're, like 0.001% or something. It's a trivial.
You're gonna get to this, that's fine, but this is crowdsourced?
Yes.
So is that increasing in the sense that it's probably being built from one direction?
Yes, so there is some bias. I'll get to that when I talk about data coverage, yeah.
Can you explain why is this 7 and not 4?
Well, I'm just counting each of these as a,
Yeah, but why do I care the middle bit?
this one?
But yeah, the middle 3, why do I care about the middle 3? That's why I look at the 4.
The middle three.
Shouldn't I just count the 1, 2, 3, 4 on the side?
These two? I mean, if these were cousins, then first cousins, then they would be distance 4, because they would share a grandparent, but they don't share a grandparent. The only way in which they're connected to each other is that they share an in-law relationship in a sense. Like these two people got married. So these two people are not related to each other in a kind of genetic sense in any way. They're just
So since you're looking at historical path, there's things like changes in transportation technology, knowledge about, marrying too close is bad for the children's health. How should we think about these things? Historical change?
I'll say that like actual cousin marriage is it's a very small share of the data. So it's like 3 or 4% of marriages in the early part of the sample are between first cousins. So, and that does decline dramatically. I haven't two other papers on that, but I think something like less than 5% of the shortest paths that I find between spouses in the data are between people who are related to each other, like who have a common ancestor. Otherwise, they just have these kind of like I guess it's coming in a few slides, but I'll show you like more actual paths. Okay, I mean, basically I see this as like studying these marriage patterns to help us understand the transition of a society from one that is more sort of family or kin centric, in the sense that the relationships that you're born with are relationships that are going to be important to you throughout your life, not only socially, but also economically. And therefore, you're going to remain close to those people by and large, versus a society where those ties are quite unimportant. And instead, the relationships that are important to you are relationships that you make, like relationships, people that you meet, that you develop, that you form new bonds. And that's an important part of being kind of successful in society. And then I'm going to try to say something about how this may be one of the factors that affects economic mobility. Okay, so
also in the US, is there a change between the parents' arranged marriage versus your free choice? Even not strict, but culturally.
Yeah.
Whether it's more likely that it's parents who introduce, and then
Yeah, I mean, there's no data on that, but I think the US, even in the early period, except for some immigrant groups, it's not a place where arranged marriage in the way you have in India, for example, would be happening.
Yeah.
But there's a continuous measure of like parental influence in marriage, like their approval or disapproval of who you'd like to marry probably matter a lot more in the earlier period and a lot less in the later period. And maybe also they're kind of suggesting someone, or those things certainly would matter. Yeah.
It speaks to the literature that Joe Henrich had on the collective brain and mobility and in how the diversity leads to the more
innovative.
That's also a strand of
for sure. Yeah. Was there another?
So I just wondering, how much of this is just is related to like the size of the town? Because if it's just a very small town, then everyone will be related to everyone else. And on top of that, it's also some towns were like founded by 5 people, 150 years ago. So then this town will have very different networks, right?
I mean-
Like somewhere people have settled for a long time.
Yeah, I agree. So, what would I say? I mean, again, I think it's still useful to think of this marriage decision as being a choice people are making. They're not just mechanically marrying whoever is near them, and so they could choose to go to the city and get a job or look for a spouse somewhere else. I mean, I realize that there's like frictions in that process, but in some ways, like I think of that as being, yeah, certainly an underlying part of what's happening. Like I will show you some relationships with, for example, population density or with urbanization, those kinds of things, but yeah, I'm not arguing against the importance of who's in your local marriage market. Yes.
Do you know if these people are actively aware that they are marrying someone who is actually related to?
No, and again, by and large, they're not related in the sense of like being blood relations. But in our data, as I'll show you later, like 97% of spouses are connected. And there is a path that connects.
They know this.
No, they probably don't know this. No.
I see.
Because they're quite, I mean, many of them are quite distant paths. I mean, some of them are short, so in the earlier period, they're mostly short.
Don't you want to argue that somehow they know each other, they're getting insurance from one another? Don't you?
The short ones, yes, not the long ones, that's what I'm saying.
Okay,
Yeah, so I'm saying that the insurance goes away once you marry far.
once you marry, okay, and how many steps are you going for?
I mean, it's a continuous measure. I'll show you some distributions and stuff. I'm not gonna make a sharp cutoff, but I'll show you how that distance is changing. But yeah, certainly like a distance of 7 or 8 or something is, I would think pretty close, like.
Okay.
I mean, here it's like your uncle and her aunt are married to each
Yeah,
other.
yeah.
You would know that. So that's to me quite
Yeah,
close.
yeah,
You're
that's-
marrying within a small kind of cluster. Okay, where was I here? Okay, so the foundation of this measure is to first construct a network using this genealogical data, where each person is a node and the edges are the relationships that we can get from this genealogical data. It's not to say these are the only relationships that matter in society, but they're kind of very primal ones, very important ones. And so what we have is parent-child ties and spousal ties. And then we use that to measure social distance between the spouses. And to give you a sense of what the raw data is that we're using, it looks kind of like this. So this is a profile on one of these websites. This is the profile of one woman, Cordelia Hay. And it shows you her husband, it shows you when they got married and where, who their children are, who her parents are, who her siblings are, and all of them have a unique ID that you can then link across everyone. That's the basic idea.
But to link them, they had to have known of. I mean,
Who had to know?
someone must know of at least you. Yeah.
Yes.
You would put,
Yeah, so what's amazing is this is such an interlinked network, and they do a lot of work to deduplicate entries, so to make sure there's a unique kind of authoritative person linked to each historical individual. And one way they do that is through census links. So there's like this huge army of people who, in their spare time, whatever, like do research on these genealogical websites, mostly Mormons. It's like a Mormon website. And because they have like theological reasons for wanting this to be as complete as possible. And just to show you, like this is in our data, if you estimate the number of marriages that would have happened in the US per year based on the population, so there's kind of using an approximation of how many marriages happen per person per year. The blue line tells you like what we think is roughly the true US marriage rate or number of marriages per year. This is a log scale here. And then the red is our data. That's like the number of marriages we have relative to what we think is the actual number of marriages. And you can see, for example, there's like the Civil War with the dip. There's, at the later period, we start having less and less good coverage. For most of the sample, we have quite good coverage. And because of that, I think, concerns about kind of selection into the sample are somewhat attenuated just because we have such a large share of the sample. However, the one big thing that is definitely kind of skewed in our sample is that there's almost no non-white people, especially in the earlier period, because like census records, for example, were not kept for slaves. There's very little kind of primary evidence to link individuals in the past, and so it's mostly just whites who are in this data. And because we need, like the way that the network is constructed to find a path, we need to have kind of people kind of behind you, like each individual needs to have like a ancestors and their spouses in the network. And so even once, even after emancipation, we're still not able to like do this for most Black spouses. Okay, and then the main so that's the sample. So that's like in terms of the full network. In terms of how we actually measure marital distance between spouses, one thing that we do to minimize the concern that the distance that we're measuring is not the true distance, but it's affected by missing data, basically. If we just use the fact that we know each person should have 4 grandparents, and we restrict our marital distance analysis to spouses where both have at least 4 grandparents, or where both have their 4 grandparents.
So no unwed mothers.
Yeah, exactly. Because if the father was not recorded in the genealogical data, then they would be, yeah.
That is a select, that's a selection, that's everybody's. So that's
Yeah.
something that's right. Singular problem, like people with missing grandparents, problem. Parents who are. Whose parents moved, grandparents moved, and they part of that.
Yeah, so these are, you're right, this also most excludes recent immigrants. So if they're first and sometimes even second generation immigrants, although we do have family tree data for many people in their kind of home country. So we're analyzing marriages that happen in the US, but often we have their parents or grandparents who lived and died abroad. But yeah, the coverage is good. I have another paper actually where we study exactly this kind of selection stuff and try to map out that, for example, yes, native-born people are of course much better represented than foreign. Okay, so this is just the data. So we have 136 million individuals in the data, 60 million marriages. 88% of the data is in one component. So just think of, one kind of, there's all these like tiny little isolated nodes that are not connected to a lot of people, but then 80% of the data is one, or of individuals are there's a path that connects all of those 121 million people. And then we have marriage records within, or there's marriages from the period that we analyzed, 750 is about 7 million, and then we focus on the ones where we know the county of marriage, where we have all the grandparents, and then like I was saying earlier, the fraction of spouses for whom we can find a common path that's not like infinity or whatever is 97%. So almost every couple there is a way to kind of connect them. Okay, maybe I'll skip this because I don't think it's implementation details. Okay, so this is an example of a real connection between 2 spouses. So each person has like an ID number, and then there's these like parental links. In this case, it's like this person's cousin was married to the sibling of the cousin of your spouse. So that's not a connection that you would know, right? You wouldn't know like that long a link. That's a distance 12 marriage. You would know even less if it's a distance 16 marriage. But again, the point is not that you would know the path, it's that again, to think of a network, if you're choosing to marry someone far from the network or near you in the network, that's something you would know in the sense of like, are they your religion? Are they from your ethnic group? Are they from your community? Do they go to the same church? Do they, all those things, as long as those are kind of persistent institutions or persistent groups that have determined marriage in the past or have been endogamous in the past, will create these short paths between spouses. And so someone who's marrying a distance 16 probably is marrying someone who's from a kind of a quite different part of society, who grew up with a different culture, who grew up with parents taught them different things, etc.
But in your example, you marry someone in the same church, but the family distance could be very big, right? So in this case, you would have the very far apart, but it's actually the person I go to church with last 10 years.
So it depends how new or old. It's actually like one of the, I don't know if let me just get to these maps. So there's something like interesting in Utah, where Mormons are in the early, like this map doesn't show that well because the counties look small, but in the early period, we have very distant marriages happening in Utah. They're basically all Mormon because they're the ones that get these records. And then over time, they become, maybe I haven't explained what I'm showing you, but the shade gets lighter, which means that people are marrying closer and closer. So you can think of like, if you create a new church from people from all over, yes, they'll be very distant from each other. But over time, once that community remains coherent and cohesive, then now the path becomes really short because now there's like these, this community has existed and is kind of maintaining its links and it's endogamous within the group. Sorry, I'm skipping all these things. Did I finish? Yeah, okay. So I'll just start by documenting this idea that I said at the beginning about how close versus distant marriages are for now just correlated with mobility. Okay. So what I mean by that is if you look at marital distance on the x-axis, and so you think of how close or far spouses are to each other, and you include birth decade by birth state fixed effect. So think of these are, you're comparing two people who were born in the same state in the same decade. So we're not comparing people across wide periods of time or across space. And we just, and also age specs, and then so this is census data, and so in the census, the standard way to divide occupations is in these 4 categories. So you have farmers, skilled, unskilled, and white collar. And basically what you see is that as marital distance increases, the probability of being a farmer goes down from about 60% to 40% or so. The unskilled, basically there's no change, but then for skilled workers, there's a large increase from 15 to 25%, and for white collars also a large increase. Now, again, yeah, I'm not saying that this is causal, although if you do this with sibling fixed effects, if you compare brothers to each other, for example, the results are very similar, a bit attenuated, but very close to this.
Sorry, I don't get what this is about. This is not different than your parents compared to you, right? This is just.
That's right, yeah, just to keep it simple, I did this, but I mean, you should think of this in the background as mostly like there's a transition from agrarian to urban work. So in the early period, basically, like 80% of people are farmers. Yeah, you can also do, I've also done like, here's your occupation. I mean, the problem with that is that you lose some sample because you need to link to the father's occupation, so you need to have it as a child, and so, but yeah, I mean, certainly that's also true. Again, you should think of like these like skilled and white collar occupations as like growing over time, starting off very small, and so in general, there's like this transition.
So sorry, so I'm getting confused.
Sorry.
So on the y-axis for skills, what does that mean? It means that.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I didn't introduce this figure enough. Okay, sorry. So this is a bin scatter showing the probability that after marriage, this is restricted to men because we have obviously better occupation data for men. After marriage, your occupation is a skilled occupation. So there's a standard classification of occupations into skilled, whatever. And so what this is saying is that if you compare 2 men who were born in the same state and same decade, but one marries at a distance of 20 and the other marries at a distance of 5 or 6, that they would have these very different probabilities of having a skilled occupation as measured post-marriage.
Right, which might be the same occupation as pre-marriage, et cetera, right? I mean.
Yeah, the mobility I'm thinking about is not necessarily, yeah.
You're not looking at, you're not looking at mobility before or post-marriage, you're just saying, okay, maybe people who live in cities, for example, are more likely to be skilled. I'm just gonna interpret it that way.
Yes.
And they also tend to marry someone who is further away in their network.
Yes.
That is to some extent. Now, you do have state fixed effects and birthday and prostate fixed effects, but still that's not.
And like I said, I also did this with like brother fixed, like sibling fixed effects.
Sibling fixed.
Yes, so if you compare 2 brothers, the same relationship holds. It's like slightly attenuated, but the same relationship is super significant, still the large magnitude. I was trying to simplify the thing, so I got rid of the sibling fixed effects. Maybe I should have added that back. And then just more outcomes, just to kind of overload you with these, like the probability of living in an urban area and your occupational income also are similarly possibly related. So again, the first point I wanted to make in this talk is just that there's a relationship between higher marital distance and mobility, geographic and occupational mobility. Maybe I should have done the actual like changes over time to show you mobility, but those are very highly correlated.
But you just said it's not about causality, right? Or-
No, yeah, right now I'm just showing you the
Yeah,
relationship.
because your arrow is pointing that way.
But it's not a double arrow.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
I think with like, yeah, I haven't shown it to you, but with the sibling fixed effects, I think there's some sense of causality, but I have an instrument that I'll show you later where I actually try to address causality issues. Okay, so
you keep on saying it's mobility, but it's not, we don't know that. We don't know that they weren't living in very different places ex ante. Or,
well, we know, for
weren't
example,
living
with
in already in an urban place, or that they weren't. That's why the brothers saying.
Yeah, the brothers have helped.
that,
Usually in this literature, when they talk about mobility, it's like compared to your parents as opposed to compared to how you were before marriage kind of thing. But I guess because I'm looking at the effect of marriage, I could look at, I mean, I do have, for example.
Compared to your parents?
No, I'm not doing
No, that's what I'm saying.
But like another outcome that I'm not showing you here is that you look at the probability of being observed in the census living in a different county than where you got married. That's also very highly increasing. So you're more likely to move post-marriage if you had a higher marital distance. You're more likely to move in between survey waves if you have a higher marital
I
distance.
think that's interesting to say.
Yeah, I had like this grid of like 12 things and I was like,
Yeah.
okay. So now 10 minutes, okay. I just wanted to document the simple fact, which is probably not going to be shocking to anyone, but that people did marry relatively close at the time. So to think about what close means, we construct this benchmark that we call county random, which is that we take all of the marriages that happen in a given county in a given year. So 1867 in some county in Massachusetts, there's, let's say, 100 marriages that happened. And then we randomly draw men and women and match them to each other, and then measure the distance between those spouses. Okay. That gives us this red line. So what is this red line? It's telling us the share of people who are connected with distance less than or equal to 6 of all the marriages in the US. But for each person, we're looking at like this random within county marriage. And so, you know, if you were to marry someone at random in your county, which I realize the county is probably bigger than maybe at the time for some places who you were able to meet, but anyway, so within a county, you know, about 5% of marriages in the very early period, and then that goes down to, you know, much less than 5% over time. Whereas if you look at actual marriages, 20% of marriages in the early period are between people who are distance 6 or less. That's a very close distance. That's a distance where you would know your connection to this person. And again, most of these, like only like I think 3% out of the 20% are cousins. So don't think of this necessarily as cousin marriage. It's just like people are marrying others that are socially very close to them. Yeah.
The trend here is going to be population size and also to like the number of generations back apart. I guess maybe that would be something useful to know is like how many generations back required, or is it most of it happening in the domain? That would help at least with the second part of the question. But like population size increases, you should have more people marrying with greater distance, right? At both the local level and
Can I add to that? I don't know if it's true about population size as long as they're all kind of expanding at the same rate, but definitely with migration. I mean, if you're having waves of immigration coming in and they have to have, you know, less connections to the population that's there, unless they're all coming from the same country in the same village and.
Yeah, I mean,
you know, that's, I don't know how you deal with immigration properly.
so I've tried, for example, looking at only restricting the sample to people who are both US born and both their parents are US born. And the fraction of people in this sample, the fraction of marriage in the sample who does not consist of both of people who are both US born and whose parents are US born is like less than 3%. Because of this restriction of having all 4 grandparents of both spouses.
Yeah.
So in practice, we're not looking at immigrants other than 3rd generation immigrants.
Okay.
So and nothing changes. Like I really looked at all the figures. Just to simplify things, I left them in there, but I could take those out of the data.
What about the population?
I mean, so another benchmark that we have is population level random marriage. So if you just randomly match people across the country, and you can see that also goes down. I mean, yeah, the average marital distance goes up when the share connected goes down, but I mean, what would I say?
But if everybody is expanding at the same rate, suppose fertility is the same for every group, and so the population is growing, everybody has 3 kids. Shouldn't the level of distance, maybe I'm thinking it wrong, not necessarily?
Yeah, I think so.
I mean,
I think that's right,
not
yeah.
clear to me, maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, if you're marrying at random, it would increase, but if you're marrying systematically within your group, I agree that it's not obvious. Yeah.
So I think there's a bit of another point about the interpretation here that you have a very precise measure of just the marriage network, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you talk about networks in general, other people have mentioned that there are other ways to connect.
Yes.
And especially with like growing population, etc. Other types of social networks may be more important, and so that could be explaining
for sure
the share here, and so this needs not be a story of the lower importance of networks. It's just that this marriage network.
I totally agree. Yes, I completely agree, and you know, in some ways, like you have to, you know, let's say you go to university and you meet your spouse at university, you might have a tight network of university friendships that are somehow supporting this marriage or underlying the marriage. You know, what I'm documenting is this transition away from what is the status quo in most societies in the world, or has been, or was the status quo for most societies in the world, which is that, you know, there's endogamy within a relatively small group. Like, you know, for example, in France, pre-modern France, there was like village endogamy, basically people married within the same village. You know, in many societies, there's like this, or caste in India, et cetera. Like there's these groups that define who you marry. And then there's taboos against marrying some people and not others. And just to say that, like, you know, the one characteristic of the modern world is that we have very few of these restrictions. People marry at very long distances, much more so than in the past. That's kind of what we're talking. Okay, so I'm running short on time, so I'm actually just going to skip this because basically just showing like the mean marital distance in the early period was like between 9 and 10. This is actual marriages, and then it goes up to like 14, 15 by 1950. And so there's this large increase in the distance between spouses. And actually, we have a companion paper where we look at the effect of industrialization. So it's not so easy to see from this graph. Basically, the slope kind of goes up when the US is in its like peak industrialization period. And we look at the kind of causal effect of industrialization at the local level on marital distance and document that. So I already showed you this a bit, but this is basically like, we can do this decade by decade. Here it's by 50 years. But you can see that in the early period, lighter colors are low marital distance. So this would be 8, and we're just kind of, anything below 8, we're just pushing it up to 8, and then everything below up 20, we count as 20, and then we show the shade. So you can see it's quite light colored. And then over time, there's like these darker colors, especially in the Midwest. Appalachia is still very light colored. Louisiana is very light colored, some parts of Maine. And then again, like the Utah with the Mormons is pretty light colored. And it remains a bit of an outlier. This is 1900 to 1950. You can see kind of the variation across the country in terms of where distances were short or were small versus distances that are long. Okay, so the last part, which I will now speed through a bit, is why marry close? So the idea of like, okay, so if there is some connection between a causal effect between marrying far and mobility, that suggests that the kind of optimal strategy is to marry someone far, like having links that are farther away from you are better. And yet people were marrying close. And it could just be like utility benefits of being with your family or being near your family or something. But if you think of it as a decision, kind of, again, an optimal decision people are making where there's these trade-offs between having a tight, cohesive group that can protect each other and provide kind of like strong ties to each other, versus having more distant ties that provide different types of benefits that allow for more mobility, then you want to have an outcome that isn't, for example, income or occupation, because those things might not be capturing the benefits that you would get from marrying close. Like the benefits you get from marrying close are things like, your grandparents are there to help you take care of your kids. It's like someone's going to take care of me in my old age. My children are going to be, there's a repeated game being played where if my kids don't take care of me in my old age, they're going to face consequences from the extended family. Whereas if we move as a isolated nuclear family to the city, and then my kids eventually abandon me and don't take care of me in my old age, there's no consequences for them. They can move on, get a job somewhere else. They're kind of free from obligations. There's also kind of the insurance, like if you're sick or if you have some need for support from the community, you're much more likely to get that if you live in this tight-knit, strong, small, closed community. And so what we use to study the causal effect of marital distance is an IV strategy that uses the random variation that comes from the fact that there is some randomness in the gender of people who are a certain distance from you. What I mean by that is imagine that you have 4 connections that are 6 links away from you that are of the right age. So we look at basically the age distribution of, or the age difference distribution of spouses. So for example, so what we use actually just as our benchmark is men who are 0 to 6 years older than their wife. So if you're a woman, you're born a certain year. So the potential men that you could marry that are 6 links away from you are the men who are 0 to 6 years older than you. And then you look at all of the people who are 0 to 6 years older than you, and you look at the number who are male versus female. So the idea is, if they're all female, then the probability of you marrying someone who's 6 years older than you is going to be very small. If they're all male, if all 4 of them are male, they're much higher. And so there's this, kind of, I think, quasi-random variation that's happening in the availability or the ability to marry someone of a certain distance if that were your preference. So you should think of this instrument as like potentially stopping someone from marrying at a certain distance if they had wanted to. You should think of the compliers as being people who would have liked to marry relatively close, because as you can imagine, the farther you go, the less you have variation in male and female, because if you have 300 people at distance 10, then it's always going to be roughly 150 to 150. So we're looking at distances from 4 to 8. So we look at we look at, you take a given individual, a given woman, for example, everyone who's 4 links away from her of the right age, everyone who's 5 links away from her of the right age, et cetera, up till 8. And then we use the number of those people who are opposite sex versus same sex. Okay. We use that to construct an instrument for marital distance, and then we look at the effect of that on longevity. We think of longevity as being kind of a summary measure of all that stuff I was talking about in terms of the extended family supporting you. I'm out of time, so I'm just going to speed through. Sorry. And basically what we find is that in the earlier period where we have these close marriages, the IV effect of marrying far is actually negative for parents. So parents actually suffer from marrying someone distant. They lose the access to those kind of benefits that the group was giving them. But on the other hand, their children do better. So their children do better if they marry far, maybe because there's like this, they move to the city, maybe it's bad for you to move to the city because it's polluted or something, but at least you're investing more in your children perhaps. Anyway, okay, so I'll minus a couple of minutes, I'll just leave it at that. And then we just show persistence with Facebook connections at the county level. But okay, so thanks.